Hi, everybody. Welcome to Night School. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Christina, the producer behind these virtual events.
And I'm Lynn from the programming team.
And we've been bringing weekly virtual nightlife and night school programs to you since Shelter in Place began. And believe it or not, this is our 12th event. So thank you so much for joining us, whether you're dropping in for the first time because you really love frogs, or if you're a long-time virtual nightlife viewer.
We've invited some amphibian experts tonight to chat more about some of our favorite nocturnal animals. Kicking off the night, we have an intro to Bay Area native frog species with Randall Museum's Zach Lim. He's also a great nature photographer, so the little frog friend that you've been seeing posted for this event is one of his images. We'll then have Dr. Rayna Bell, the Academy's Curator of Herpetology, giving us a lesson on frog eyes and vision. And we'll close the night off with Ana Longo from the University of Florida and her work on the endangered Puerto Rican cave frog.
And tonight's program is totally live, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and in the comments, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And so that's all for us. We're going to leave, and here's Zach.
Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Zach and I'm a curator at the Randall Museum here in San Francisco, and I was actually the former amphibian specialist at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. Today we're going to talk about the coolest animals in the world, frogs and toads. We don't have a lot of time, so let's begin. First, we must ask the question of all ages. What is a frog? Frogs are amphibians. Amphibians are cold-blooded or ectothermic vertebrates that are found throughout the world. They are in the order Anura, which means tailless. All frogs and toads are tailless as adults. When we think about frogs, we often think about the idea of a metamorphic life cycle of change. All frogs kind of start out as an egg, then they develop into a larva, like a tadpole or a pollywog. Then they start changing. They become a metamorph, which they're still in the water, but they have little legs and little arms. From there, the tail kind of reduces in and they pop up as an adult. And another question we usually ask when we talk about frogs are, what's the difference between a frog and a toad? Well, all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. That might seem a bit confusing, but it's not. We'll clear that up right now. Frogs. What do we think of when we think of frogs? Frogs typically have smooth and moist skin. They are capable jumpers, swimmers, and climbers. That is that frogs, be it like a bullfrog or a tree frog, they're really good at climbing or swimming. And in the case of an arboreal species like a tree frog, they're good at climbing, jumping. Frogs are typically more aquatic. You usually find frogs in bodies of water. They readily jump in the water and swim away. There are some even fully aquatic frogs out there too. And as always with anything in life, there's always exceptions to the rules. Now let's talk about their friends, the toads. Toads, probably my favorite animal in the world. Toads are typically dry and have warty skin. When we think about toads, we kind of think about a bumpy, kind of grumpy little guy, and we think about the little warts they have on their backs. Those are not actually warts. You can't get warts from touching a toad. And you can't get warts if a toad pees on you. All a lie. Bad press for toads. Furthermore, toads have large parotoid glands located in the back of their eyes, usually on the back of their heads. Behind their eyes, you can have two big bumps or two big warts. These toads are these glands are really important for the toads because they actually help release toxins when the toad isn't disturbed. These toxins could be quite mild or quite dangerous to any animal that may try to eat the toad. Compared to the frogs that are typically jumpers and climbers, toads are walkers and hoppers. They tend to kind of shuffle around in their habitat to get away and kind of plop themselves in the water. They can swim, but they're not as powerful swimmers as most frogs are. As we know, they have their dry and warty skin, and they're kind of walkers and hoppers, meaning that they're usually associated to drier habitats. Toads can actually be found in the deserts here in California. Like down south, you'll have really cool species like the red spotted toads and various species of spadefoot toads. That being said, there's always exceptions to the rules. There are some toads like the Suriname toad that is fully aquatic and that they kind of have babies on their back, really cool species. So now that we have a brief intro on frogs versus toads, let's talk about their habitats, specifically the habitat types found here in the San Francisco Bay Area, as that's the topic of the day. We are so lucky to be in the San Francisco Bay Area and surrounded by a variety of different habitat types. We have the oceans, we have the mountains surrounding the Bay Area, and we have grasslands and chaparral and oak forest, redwood forest in between. It's within these habitat types that we find these special amphibians, the frogs and the toads. The first one would be the riparian corridors. Riparian kind of means the land on opposite sides or within a waterway. So for example, the creek that runs through a redwood forest, the riparian zone of that would be kind of the edge of it where the plants and all the trees are growing. Second type of habitat you'll encounter frogs and toads would be the idea of vernal pools, also known as ephemeral pools. These are temporary bodies of water that usually forms after some heavy rain. For example, you have a pond that's dry most of the season, but after heavy rain, it will fill up with water and it will eventually disappear and evaporate as the weather gets hotter. And next, we have permanent bodies of water, such as lakes and ponds. Throughout these areas, you will find frogs and toads, usually hanging out, hiding along the banks during the daytime, maybe trying to bask, or maybe even undercover until it becomes nighttime where they're more active. Let's move on. Let's talk about the species that reside here in the Bay Area. Throughout California, there's around 40 species or subspecies of frogs and toads, all the way from the coastal redwoods to kind of the Central Valley, down to deserts. They're all different types of frogs and toads, 40 of them about. In the Bay Area proper, we have 5 native species. There are invasive species such as the bullfrogs and Africanclawed frogs, but for the sake of brevity and for the sake of this talk, we're just going to talk about the 3 frogs and 2 toads that are found here in the San Francisco Bay Area. They all occupy various habitat types, and I'll try to remember to include them when we talk about each of them in our species profile. Let's get started. The first one is a very, very common frog that we can find throughout all of the Bay Area, and this is the Sierran tree frog. In older literature, you might know them as the Pacific tree frog. These are a small frog that are found in all various habitat types, like I said, from vernal pools to creeks and to big ponds and lakes. Despite the name tree frog, these guys are actually a type of chorus frog. And rather than being super arboreal like the tree frogs you might find in the southeast, these guys tend to be close to the ground. They'll maybe climb some reeds and some grasses, but never too high up in trees. Here's a happy little fella hiding in some leaves. These guys are really small. They're actually variable in coloration. Some are bright greens, like the one that were pictured here, or some can be brown and tan, spotless, or without patterns. It's a very interesting species. During the warm summer nights and even into the later fall and winter time when they're breeding, this is probably the most likely frog that you're going to hear calling during a rainy night. Let's move on to our next species. Our first big frog of the day is the California red-legged frog. This is the state amphibian of California. These large body ranids meaning a true frog. Imagine when you think of a frog sitting on a lily pad, you're probably imagining a ranid, a big burly frog with big legs to jump. That's typically what biologists consider ranid frogs, for a very concise way of saying that. These guys were once found throughout California in vast numbers. However, due to our early settlers and people during the gold rush eating them, introducing bullfrogs and destroying habitat, these beautiful frogs have actually declined greatly in their range and in population. Here's another photo of a California red-legged frog that I photographed during a night hike along the coast. They're variable in coloration. As you said, this one is quite red, while the other one was more frog. Frog as in kind of green, kind of brown with spots. It's a very beautiful species, and they are quite sizable, and they are powerful jumpers and swimmers, and usually find these guys around vernal pools and ephemeral pools, as well as permanent ponds and lakes. Let's check out our next species here. Another ranid, but not as large as the California red-legged frog, is the Foothill yellow-legged frog. These guys are a species of special concern here in California, as their populations are sadly declining throughout the range due to invasive bullfrogs and habitat destruction as well, amongst other things that we'll get to when we talk about conservation later on. Yellow-legged frogs are typically found in rocky mountain streams. They prefer to kind of bask along the sides in these stream areas, these riparian zones that we talked about earlier. An interesting fact about these frogs is that the Oakland Zoo was actually doing a reintroduction program with these frogs, which is very, very beneficial for this species. Our next species here is a really fun one. These guys here are known as the Western spadefoot toads, or spadefoots for short. It's a very, very, very adorable frog, let's be real here. And they're called spadefoot for a reason. On the back of their hind legs, you're gonna have bony protrusions on each side, right here and here on their hind legs. Those little spades are used for digging. These frogs are quite fossorial and dig deep burrows underground. These guys are also explosive breeders, meaning that these frogs, you might not really see them throughout the year until heavy rain shows up, where they will come up in mass and breed as fast as they can, laying their eggs and disappearing back underground. At this time, these frogs' eggs will hatch into their larvae and develop quickly in adults as fast as they can before these pools dry out. The spadefoot toad is also toxic. When disturbed, they will release some toxins on their parotid glands that we talked about earlier, and it's noted that they kind of smell like peanuts or peanut butter when that happens. It's quite an interesting species. Let's go on to our next and possibly final one. This is probably my favorite species of frog or toad, frog and toad being, they're both Anura, so same thing essentially. Found here in Northern California in the Bay Area, it's the California toad, a big burly California toad. Let's just take a quick look at this photo really quickly. If you notice behind the eyes of this happy little fella, you see these big, large warts. Those are the parotid glands we were talking about earlier. When disturbed, they release a white milky substance from these glands, which are toxic and quite distasteful for any potential predators. As we mentioned earlier when we were talking about difference between the frogs and the toads, both the spadefoot toad and the California toad generally reside in drier habitat types, more open grassland, rolling hills, chaparral habitat types. And they usually come up and hang around the vernal pools when they are available. As you can see, this toad here is burrowed in the ground. They are quite fossorial and they'll actually live in burrows, and they kind of even reside in other animals' burrows. You can often find these toads when you kind of peer into with a flashlight into ground squirrel burrows. It's quite interesting to see. All right. Probably the most important topic when we're talking about frogs and toads, even if we're talking about our local species, is the idea of conservation. Unfortunately, amphibians are going through one of the largest mass extinctions in our lifetime. There's quite a large decline of amphibian population biodiversity worldwide. And there's some various causes for this, and we're just going to talk about some of the main and most concerning ones. The first one is the idea of the chytrid fungus. There are tons of different types of chytrid fungus out there, but the specific ones that target vertebrates, target amphibians, and that's called Batrachochytrium. This fungus causes the skin of a frog or toad, or there's also a salamander version of the chytrid fungus that causes their skin to thicken. Amphibians, they do a lot of gas exchange and water exchange, and they actually breathe through their skin. So if their skin thickens, it'd be harder for them to perform these vital actions and actually causes them to decline, to die. The second cause would be habitat loss. That shouldn't be a surprise. That's no surprise there. Walmarts just don't grow on trees. Buildings don't grow on trees. Roads just don't appear. Habitat, unfortunately, has to be destroyed in order for our idea of progress. When habitat is lost, we lose a lot of crucial ponds, waterways, and various other types of places that these animals will live. Another cause would be the idea of pollution. Pollution can come in various forms. Could be just some things we toss out or even things we use to better our lives, such as insecticides and herbicides. Again, as we mentioned that frogs and toads can breathe through their skin, these toxins and pollutants can actually go into their bodies, and it ain't good for them. How we can help. There are various ways we can help to stop the kind of decline of our amphibian friends, our frog and toad buddies. First, to respect the habitat. If you're out hiking around and you see a pond, maybe be gentle when you walk in there and try to look for, don't like walk right into the pond, and just watch where you're walking or watch where you're hiking when you're in potential habitat of amphibians, specifically frogs and toads. You don't need to like kind of trample on things and don't need to really mess up the habitat when you're trying to observe these shy and very delicate creatures. The next idea is kind of connects with respect of the habitat to stop the spread of the fungus. This fungus is spread through ways that we might not even think about. For example, if we walk into a vernal pool or a puddle of water even that frogs may be used for breeding, we can track this fungus on our boots or shoes and carry it off a couple yards to another body of water. That's not good. We can stop this by letting our boots and shoes kind of dry out for about 3 hours or more. Overnight would be great if you're planning to go out to another habitat type in the future. Furthermore, if you have a pet dog or something and you let them jump into a pond, you might see when you're going through a state park or anywhere you can actually bring a dog. Not sure if you can bring dogs to state parks. If your dog jumps into a pond and goes to another one, that's another way of spreading the fungus. Another one is the introduction or release of invasive species such as bullfrogs. Don't do that. Don't release any species of frog or amphibian or any animal really to a habitat they don't belong in that can spread this fungus. Lastly, we should limit our pesticide and herbicide use. It might seem fine and dandy to kind of spray our vegetable gardens or spray our rose bushes to reduce pests. But when it rains, these chemicals can leach out into the soil and kind of flow out into areas where these amphibians may reside. That's pretty much the talk. I gotta shout out some of the people that made my descent into frogdom great. Here's the list of people. You can read them. Some citations if you want to know more about the chytrid fungus, and of course, Stebbins, the guide to all things Bay Area herps, and CaliforniaHerps.com. And now we can answer some questions that I have here that have been given to me. First one, are frogs in a different classification from toads? Well, if you came late, you missed my talk about that, but all toads are frogs, not all frogs are toads. They are all in the order Anura. So technically, yes, frogs and toads are the same thing. There are some subtle differences, but for the most part, they are the same thing. Is it true that the Sierra tree frog is the only frog with that classic ribbit sound or a call? They do have a classic ribbit call. A question from Evan, do frogs have specific areas for gas exchange on their bodies, or can their whole body function for breathing? Oh, do we have more questions than that? Oh, we do. They can go through it through their mouths and their skin. And I'm going up to see other questions here. Question from Armando, is the Africanclawed frog the one used in the Calaveras County frog jumping contest? Funny you say that, no. Mark Twain's famed jumping frog of Calaveras County, I believe that is the right term he said, is the red-legged frog. I am not sure what they use now, but it probably is a ranid because they're made for jumping. Africanclawed frogs, they're fully aquatic, they don't really jump. And I think we have one more question if we have time. Zach, what is your favorite frog species from Brian? Or actually, Brian said that was my favorite frog species. I'm gonna go with type of toad. I don't know what, I don't want to pick favorites amongst my peers, frogs and toads, but yeah. And that's the talk. I hope you guys learned some useful information about how we can treat our frog and toad buddies well. And yeah, hope you have a froggy night. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to be talking a little bit about vision in frogs and toads, which is a somewhat technical topic. So I'm going to give you a quick intro to vision biology, and then we'll explore some of the diversity that is present in frogs and toads. So why study vision? Well, organisms rely on their senses like touch and hearing and vision and smell to interpret their surroundings, to find food, to avoid predators, to find mates, and a whole bunch of other really important behaviors. And frogs are amazing animals because they've adapted to live in a wide variety of environments, including tropical rainforests and deserts, and some species spend most of their lives underground. Other species spend their lives in the trees. Other species are active during the day, and some species only come out at night. And then there are some species that are completely aquatic and that spend their full lives in the water. And then, as you just saw, many species have a major transition in their development, and they undergo metamorphosis from an aquatic tadpole to a terrestrial adult. And so all of these factors are influencing how a frog is perceiving its environment. And of course, vision is playing a really important role in how a frog senses its environment. And so because frogs have evolved to live in all these diverse habitats, they're a really exciting group to study how their eyes have responded to these different environments in which they need to be able to see. So the next couple slides are going to be a little bit textbooky, but I'll try to make it as exciting as I can. So the vertebrate eye, and vertebrates are all animals that have backbones, but the vertebrate eye is a really complicated light detection organ, and it's made up of multiple really specialized components. Unlike most vertebrates, frogs have a cool structure on their eye called the nictitating membrane, which I've shown here at the lower left. And this is a transparent third eyelid, and it provides protection and moisture to the eye, but it still allows light to pass through. And so some species close this third eyelid to protect their eye when they're active underwater. And some species, like this Australian lace-lid frog, have this really elaborate pattern on their nictitating membrane that serves to camouflage the eye. So light first enters the eye through the cornea, and then it passes through the pupil and is projected from the lens onto the retina at the back of the eye. And the retina is a thin layer of neural tissue that absorbs light and passes on that signal to the brain by the optic nerve. Frogs also have another special structure called the tapetum lucidum, which is this reflective layer, and it reflects light that wasn't initially absorbed by the retina when light first entered the eye. And so it reflects that light and gives the retina a second chance to absorb that light signal. And that provides a second opportunity for light to be detected, which can be important if the animal is in a really dim light environment. And so this tapetum lucidum structure is found in a lot of nocturnal animals, and it's responsible for the eye shine that you can see in animals like cats. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in onto the retina to look at the major cell types. So we have this dark layer, the retinal pigment epithelium, which provides the blood supply to maintain vision. And then we have the photoreceptors, which are these rods and cones, and they're responsible for absorbing that light and then producing the signal that will ultimately result in vision. And we'll talk more about these cells in a minute. And then we have several types of nerve cells, these gray, pink, and blue cells that are involved in transmitting the light signal and coordinating information from all the different photoreceptor cells. And then the yellow cells are the ganglion cells, and these are the output neurons of the retina, and they cluster together to form the optic nerve that goes to the brain. So there are two main types of photoreceptor cells, and you probably have heard of these before, rods and cones. And so even though they're different sizes and shapes, they're both made up of the same main compartments. So we have these outer segments, which are the light-sensitive parts of the cell. And then we have the basic cell machinery, like the mitochondria and the nucleus. And then the synaptic terminal at the base, which releases a neurotransmitter to transfer the signal when light is detected. So although they have the same compartments, as you've probably noticed, these cell types differ in their sizes and in their morphology, and they also differ in their sensitivity to light. So rods are optimized for dim light vision. They're highly sensitive to light, but they react slowly, and the images that they produce are less sharp. And cones, on the other hand, are optimized for bright light and color vision, and they're less sensitive to light, but they react quickly and they can produce sharp, crisp images. Rod and cone photoreceptors also vary in their sensitivities to different wavelengths of the light spectrum. So the light spectrum ranges from red to ultraviolet, and we can use a tool called microspectrophotometry to measure the sensitivity of individual rod or cone cells. And we expose them to the entire spectrum of light, and we calculate which wavelengths or colors of light they're most sensitive to. And so this curve here is showing you the range of the light spectrum that a typical frog rod photoreceptor is sensitive to, which is the green part of the spectrum. Most vertebrates have multiple types of cone photoreceptors, and these are sensitive to different parts of the light spectrum. And so comparing information from these different classes of cones is what enables color vision in the animal. And so even though I mentioned that most vertebrates have just one type of rod photoreceptor for vision in dim light, frogs and some salamanders have a second type of rod called the green rod. And despite what their name suggests, the peak sensitivity of the green rods is actually in the blue and violet range of the light spectrum. And so here I'm showing its sensitivity compared to regular rods. So what's the benefit of having these two different types of rods? Well, behavioral studies are providing evidence that in some frog species, having both green and red rods might allow for color vision even in dim light conditions when their cones are not functioning. And so having this novel green rod photoreceptor likely provides these frogs with nocturnal color vision that can help them navigate at night and potentially identify their mates. So this is a lovely set of illustrations of red-eyed tree frogs, which are a nocturnal species. And there's growing evidence that visual signals and color differences between populations are an important part of mate choice. And so nocturnal color vision is a really exciting area of research in frog biology and behavior. Okay, so now you have a little bit of background on vision. And so let's start looking at some of the variation in frogs. First, the size of the eye, both in terms of the absolute eye size, but also how eye size scales relative to the total size of the frog, varies widely across the frog tree of life. And eye size determines how much light can enter the eye and be captured by the photoreceptors. And so eye size variation is likely related to the visual needs of different species and the light environments that they're seeing in. And so here we have on the far end of the eye size spectrum, the Mexican burrowing toad. And these are burrowing frogs that spend a lot of their time underground. And a lot of species that have this lifestyle tend to have very small eyes. And so that suggests that they don't rely very much on vision to sense their environments. And they might be relying more on other sensory systems that they have. And then tree frogs, like this Principe giant tree frog, are active at night, and they tend to have really large eyes that would increase their ability to detect light even in these dim light conditions. And so in looking at this variation across different species, one of our hypotheses for our frog vision project is studying how eye size varies across hundreds of different species to see whether eye size is correlated with the habitat that a species lives in, as well as other aspects of their lifestyle. And the short answer is that yes, we're finding very strong correlations between several aspects of a given frog species lifestyle and their relative eye sizes and absolute eye sizes. Okay, so the shape of the pupil and the ability to change the size and the opening or size of the opening of the pupil can affect how much light enters the eye and also which wavelengths of light will enter the eye. And so in frogs, pupil shapes come in a wide variety including circular, horizontal slits, and more complex shapes. And so here's just a sampling of a few different types of species and sort of a zoomed up cartoon of what their pupil shapes are. And we have collected lots of data on frog pupil shapes, but we're just starting to analyze the data. We're very interested in whether we can find an association between pupil shape and the ecology of different frog species, because that's currently unknown. And so far, we've just been blown away by the diversity of pupil shapes that we've encountered across the frog tree of life. So this has been a really fun project. Okay, so then within the retina, frog species have different combinations of rods and cones depending on their lifestyles and their visual needs. So the American bullfrog has two types of cones, red and blue, and it has both the regular rods and the green rods. And you can see here sort of the range of wavelength that it can detect with its full suite of photoreceptors. And then we have the strawberry poison frog, which has lost the green rod that is found in most other species of frogs. And this is a diurnal or day active species, and so that might explain why they've lost those green rods. And then we have Africanclawed frogs, which have typical red cones, and then they have the red rods or regular rods and the green rods, and it's not known whether or not they have blue cones. No one's been able to find them yet. So this is just 3 frogs of the more than 7,000 species that have been described so far. And most of those species, we know absolutely nothing about their visual systems. And so describing some of this diversity and understanding how it has evolved is one of our major research focuses. And we are currently analyzing genomic data and photoreceptor sensitivity data from over 100 species spread out all across the frog tree of life. And so hopefully we'll have answers to some of these questions soon, but I'm going to share the results from one project that is nearly complete. So this is the life cycle of the leopard frog, which, like most species of frogs and toads, starts as an aquatic tadpole, seeing and living in water, and then it transitions through metamorphosis to living and seeing on land as an adult. And so what does this have to do with vision? Well, on land, the entire spectrum of light is available for the eye to detect, and that light spectrum doesn't change much as it passes through air. But in water, water and particles in the water filter light so that the amount of light decreases with depth, and then also the extremes of the light spectrum, so the ultraviolet and violet parts of the light spectrum and the red parts of the spectrum, are filtered out first as light passes through to deeper depths. And so what that means is that the spectrum of light in water is different from that on land. And so because the lifestyle of leopard frogs means that they are moving from these two very different environments as they go through their life cycle, that the morphology and the function of the eye also likely needs to change so that it can meet the visual needs at these different stages. So in our study, we measured the sensitivity of the same regular red rod photoreceptor cell types and other cell types in the tadpole and adult of the leopard frog. And what you can see here is that the tadpole's rods are shifted about 25 nanometers towards the redder part of the light spectrum compared to the adults. So how does this work? Well, the light-sensitive proteins in the photoreceptors interact with something called a chromophore, which is a form of vitamin A. And the chromophore comes in 2 different types, vitamin A1 and vitamin A2. And depending on which form is present in the retina, even if everything else about the photoreceptor is the same, it will change the light sensitivity of that photoreceptor. So the vitamin A1 spectrum here is shown in green. And then if you were to swap out the vitamin A1 with vitamin A2 and change nothing else about the photoreceptors, it would shift the sensitivity of that photoreceptor more towards the red part of the light spectrum. And so in the leopard frog species that we were studying, it looks like the tadpoles are using this vitamin A2 form of the chromophore, and our genetic data also supported this result. And so the difference in sensitivity that we observed between the tadpoles and the adults likely enhances their vision and the different environments that they're living in. And in terms of where the tadpoles are living, often murkier freshwater is shifted more towards the red wavelengths of light. And so being able to have a visual system that's more adapted to detecting red shifted light during the tadpole life stage, but then going back to more towards the green part of the light spectrum at the adult life cycle stage is probably advantageous. And so we predict that this same process is probably occurring in many other species of frogs, but it's only been investigated in one other species so far. Oh yeah, sorry, this was to show you which life stage is using which vitamin A. So even though we think that these differences between tadpoles and adults are likely happening in many different frog species, we think there are also probably many different or many exceptions to this. And so some frogs, like the Africanclawed frogs, live in the same aquatic habitats as tadpoles and as adults. And so we might expect that their eyes don't change much between life stages. And then there are these crazy tadpoles of these Indian dancing frogs. And these tadpoles were a mystery for a really long time. Nobody had documented them in the scientific literature. And it's because they live within the gravel sediments of streams. So they were really, really difficult to find. And as you can imagine, their visual needs in that habitat are probably quite different than most tadpoles that are swimming around in the water column. And then some species like the desert rain frog, which is very famous now on the internet, skip the tadpole life stage entirely, and they go through development within the egg, hatching out as fully formed miniature versions of adult frogs. And so this is a lifestyle that's called direct development, and we don't know very much about how this form of development affects the visual system compared to species that have aquatic tadpoles. So we're very interested to compare direct developing species with species that have the more traditional life cycle of having an aquatic tadpole stage. So there's still a lot to discover. Okay, so the lightning summary of what you have learned tonight is frog eyes vary in many different ways to enhance vision in the specific habitats they live in. Frogs have green rods that might provide the ability for nocturnal color vision, and this is very exciting. And lastly, the life cycle of frogs varies, and this likely puts different demands on the development and the function of their visual systems. And so with that, I would like to thank all my colleagues who are part of the Frog Vision team, and we got to pose with Darwin at one of our retreats at the Natural History Museum in London. So he's an honorary member of our team. All right, and that's that, and I will take some questions. Oh, okay. Lots of good ones. Okay, from Evan, can frogs be colorblind? Yes. So color blindness occurs when you lose photoreceptor types. So basically, rod photoreceptors are often described as being for black and white vision and cone photoreceptors for color vision. But really the key is that you just need to have more than one photoreceptor type or cells that are sensitive to different parts of the light spectrum to be able to detect color. And so if a frog or any other type of vertebrate animal only has a rod photoreceptor or only has one type of cone photoreceptor, then they would be colorblind. They would only be able to detect the presence or the absence of light. Question from Matthew, do other amphibians have green rods? Yes, salamanders also have green rods. And the other class of of amphibians called caecilians have very, very reduced eyes. And so they have lost most of the structures associated with the eye. And as far as we know, they only have one photoreceptor type, the regular red rod type. And question from Sebastian, does eye position on the head vary between frog species? Do they have depth perception? If not, how do they know how far to jump / shoot their tongue when eating? Great questions. Yes, eye position varies between species, and it is related to ecology. So species that have eyes positioned more dorsally on top of their head, as opposed to in the front or on the sides, tend to be species that are sort of hunkering down and looking upwards for predators or for prey that they're going to ambush and attack. So they basically need to be able to see upwards. Most frog species have laterally positioned eyes that are more on either side of their head, and that's so that they can have almost a 360-degree field of view, because they're trying to avoid predators most likely, and so they want to be able to detect predators coming from every direction. And then some frogs have more forward-oriented eyes, and we haven't really tried to quantify this yet, but it certainly seems like a lot of tree frogs have more forward-oriented eyes, and that would enhance their binocular vision and their depth perception, and presumably would be very important for things like knowing how far to jump and being able to mark their target when they're capturing prey. So that's all we have time for. Thanks for chiming in. And I have a couple links that I'll share with our hosts that they can post in the chat if you're interested in learning more about frog vision.
All right, that was awesome. So today I'm gonna be talking about another frog. So this is gonna be the Puerto Rican cave frog, and we call it Eleutherodactylus cooki. And it's a very interesting species, and I'm really excited to be able to share some aspects of its reproductive ecology, the conservation, and parasitism. So let's start our visual trip. We can't go anywhere, right? But close your eyes and think that we're going right now to Puerto Rico, which for those of you that don't know, is right here in the Caribbean. So let's start to know where this frog lives. So the Puerto Rican cave frog is an endemic species to the island of Puerto Rico, where I was born and raised. And an endemic, what means is that it's not found anywhere else in the whole world. More specifically, it occurs here in the southeastern part of the island, and the range is very small. So we're talking about around 56 square miles, and this area is definitely comparable to the San Francisco city. So it's almost the same size. So you might be thinking like, wait, Hurricane Maria was in Puerto Rico, and it was very devastating in this island, right? So I wanted to show you exactly where the hurricane path went through, and you see that it went straight through the frog's distribution. So our colleagues in Puerto Rico have reported the species, and the frogs are still calling, but we don't know how the populations were affected in terms of the numbers. So we're planning to restart our research there as soon as we can, but now with the pandemic, everything's kind of stopped at the moment. All right, so these coqui frogs are habitat specialists. They live exclusively associated to these rock formations which look like really large boulders that were formed millions of years ago through cooling and solidification of lava. People in Puerto Rico call these rocks guajonales, and for those of you out in the west side of the United States, Half Dome in Yosemite is made of granodiorite. So these huge boulders, right, are covered with vegetation. Some are in small streams, others form caves that we can actually crawl inside. So why this coqui is considered a threatened species by Fish and Wildlife? Well, it's because most of its habitats occur in privately owned lands, right? So we have very few of these habitats that are protected by a forest preserve or a conservation area. And this is a very highly specialized species that all aspects of its natural history are associated with this type of rock. There are many threats to these habitats, including habitat destruction, as Zach also mentioned in the first talk. There are floods, and there's landslides as well. So all of these threats, right, can definitely modify the optimum requirements for the species survival. And as part of our research projects, we always try to include an outreach component to educate the public around these areas on how their behaviors can impact the species. So Chapman Grant was the person who first described the species in 1932. He was a major from the US Army, and if the last name sounds familiar to you, yes, he's related to President Ulysses Grant. And Chapman actually was his last living grandson. I have an excerpt here highlighted some interesting bits of the description of the species. And he describes the frog as the most romantic species of the island. And I truly believe that. And it's just because the sound is very, very nice. He also talks about the guajonales, and he mentions that the guajones, and here in the bottom, it's only a voice because no one had never seen one. And it took him 3 days to finally spot them. So they were like really buried in these rock formations. And we call this species the coqui guajon. So right now, I want to show you a short video of one of the sites. So you'll hear the call of the frogs in the background. You'll see us working around the caves and entering. It's going to be very dark. We have to maneuver around, and it's very little space. Okay, I'm going to play it. Hopefully it works. All right, so for those of you that are claustrophobic, well, it's very tight inside. And let me tell you, it's like super fun to be there doing this type of field work. However, I'm a little bit concerned now of returning to work there because Puerto Rico has been constantly shaking for the last 7 months. But anyways, we usually set up our area in the dark and we try to collect the animals there, and we measure them and weigh them and study their pathogens and their parasites. So the guajones are one of the 17 species of coqui frogs in Puerto Rico, and all of them are direct developing frogs. And Rayna mentioned in her talk that these are frogs that are completely terrestrial. They have terrestrial eggs, and they don't have tadpoles. So all the metamorphosis is occurring within this egg. In the case of the coqui guajon, it also exhibits parental care. So the male is going to be staying with the egg clutch for several days. So most of the frogs in the Caribbean are actually direct developing frogs. We have like very few species that are actually aquatic with a tadpole, and it's just because the places are more prone to like have moisture in the plants, and they use these humid surfaces in the environment to just do the gas exchange. So as I show you here in this egg, this is how they look. So everything is occurring, the metamorphosis is occurring inside the egg. So let's look at some of the adaptations of this Puerto Rican cave frog. So when you see a guajon in comparison to other coqui frogs in Puerto Rico, the first thing you're going to notice is the big eyes. And Rayna was talking about vision, right? So they really need those big eyes to be able to see in the dark. So you see huge eyes, right? And you see very long legs, and you see very large toe pads as well. The other thing that you might notice is that they lack this, they don't have interdigital membranes between their toes. It's because they're not built to swim. So, but they are very equipped and built for clinging and traction, and they really are. So these pictures are a close-up of their toes. And if you look at all of those ridges and structures, does it remind you of something? To me, these epithelial cells look like tire treads. So these frogs need to be moving through these vertical surfaces, and they cannot fall, so they have to cling really well to it no matter which angle they are. So another thing interesting about this species is that it's characterized by having sexual dimorphism. And what this means is that males and females are different, in this case in size and also in coloration. So for example, in here in this graph in the left, we have plotted hundreds of frogs that we've studied over the years, and you can see how the density of the points, for the males, it's a little bit smaller than for the females here at the right. So this means that the males and females have different sizes, where the females are larger than the males. So these numbers here are in millimeters, but if you want to think about in terms of like something that you can hold right now, so maybe like if you think about like a third of your phone that you're holding, so they could be pretty big. The other thing is that they different in coloration. So here on the left, we have a female, so mostly like brownish color, but then the male has this yellow coloration in the throat, and it can extend also to its sides as well. So one interesting thing is like, why do males have this coloration? And it's because studies that have been done in this species are showing that the females are using this coloration to choose which males to mate. So they like males with more coloration, and this, especially if it extends way to their thighs, so more yellow, better for them. And it's because they are highly reproductive. They have high reproductive success. They are better parents, and that's what the females are looking for. So once the females have chosen this lucky male, the amplexus, or this is frog sex, can last for hours, up to a whole day. And these frogs have an internal fertilization, and it's not shown in this picture, but usually the female is the one that clasps the male with her hind legs. And this is how it looks here in one of the habitats. So once the female lays its eggs, right, she goes away and never returns. So she goes to the forest, and the poor father has to take care of all the eggs. And trust me that they do a great job. They attend, they incubate and defend up to 4 clutches at the same time. I mean, that's really cool. But they can do that because while they're watching their kids, right, they're still increasing their fitness by mating with other females. So it takes them around 20 to 29 days for those eggs to develop. And remember that these eggs are gonna go through metamorphosis inside the egg, and then once they hatch, they're gonna be a little miniature version of the adult frog, and they're not gonna have any tails at all. So the coloration of these newborn frogs is very different to their parents, which has a more uniform brown color. So in this picture, I wanted to show you a juvenile frog, and these animals, an animal like this could be maybe a couple months old, up to a year. We don't know exactly when they become a reproductive adult, but in other species, like the common coqui frogs, it takes them up to a year to reach maturity. So the juveniles are like hopping around the caves in leaves and low vegetation, and this coloration probably helps them to camouflage and avoid the predators. So one of the most interesting things about this species is that we're going to be talking about ticks and parasitism. Did you know that frogs can get ticks? No, you probably didn't, and I didn't know until I was in college. And I was like so fascinated about this phenomenon. So can you spot them in this picture? So I can help you here. So you can see like on the side, let me see if I can use the pointer. So they are over here. There's another one over there. And the Mohun is one of the species in Puerto Rico that has this obvious tick parasitism. So almost 70% of our study sites have the presence of this tick. And males are disproportionately more infected than females. And this is possibly because of the prolonged exposure that they experience as part of this very specialized mating behavior. So males are going to be calling inside the caves and burrows, as I showed you in the video, and that's where the ticks are present. So they're going to be more static, right? So ticks can be more easily parasitize them. So this is another picture of very heavily parasitized frogs. And this is our record. These are 41 ticks, and it's crazy. So let me just use the pointer again. But you can see ticks over here. You can see ticks over here between their toes and over here. So there's a lot of them. So 41. So this frog was very lethargic, and you see how the coloration, it's different at the location where the ticks are attached. So I wanted also to show you how the ticks looks under the microscope. They are very scary, at least to me. So look at this hypostome. So this is like a harpoon-like structure, and I'm going to use the pointer again. So this is what they use to anchor and parasitize the frog while they draw out all the blood while they feed on these poor frogs. So the tick larvae usually parasitize adult frogs, but in this picture is the only one that we actually have. And let me point again. This is an adult tick that is like walking around through a recently hatched egg clutch, right? And these are the newly born frogs. So you can imagine, right? Like, it's incredible that if one single tick can infest like one of these frogs, they'll probably kill them, right? So we don't know for sure, but we'll be testing it soon. So keep tuned for that. All right. So when you think about the relative size in comparison of these ticks, right, with the frog, I always joke that it could be similar to having, I don't know, like a cockroach attached to our side or to our fingers. So the real question is, like, does having ticks really matter? And we believe so. We've seen how the coloration is affected on the frogs. So more white and dull colors might potentially affect the ways like females can perceive those frogs and might also don't want to mate with them, right? We have seen frogs that are more lethargic and that they lose their toe pads, which are very important for their ability to climb and move inside the caves. The other thing is that our latest research is also showing that the ticks are attached to these males differ in the kind of diversity of bacteria they carry. So this picture is here at the right is a little bit technical, but I just wanted to show you that there are more sequences of bacteria in those frogs that have very little yellow coloration, and some of them, including like rickettsias, are known pathogens for frogs and also in humans as well. So we see that these frogs that have like less coloration might be carrying more pathogens as well. So that's why females need to choose those really bright yellow males that are categorized as number 3. So there's this potential that high quality males are not only good as parents, right? But they also have a very good health. And this is a trait that females are looking for. All right, so with that, I'm gonna close my talk, and I would thank you for attending all of our talks, and I'll be answering some of your questions. Before that, I wanna thank you to a couple of people, especially Alberto Lopez, who provided all of these amazing pictures. All right, let me look around here. So question, do frogs get other types of parasites and fleas? So far, we haven't seen any fleas on them. They definitely get in some parasites inside, like they also get the chytrid fungus as well. So it's not a parasite, but it's a pathogen. So they do get other things. I have another question. Are these cave frogs or other frogs that don't go through the tadpole phase stages more distantly related to frogs that do go through all the different stages, or has the trait developed separately for each frog species? Yeah, so direct development has evolved many times in the amphibian phylogeny. So it's not only found in here, but for this family of frogs, they're mostly direct developing species. But other examples could be some salamanders in the eastern part of the United States too. They're direct developers as well. So it has evolved several times. All right, and chytrid fungus affecting a lot of the cookies. Yeah, we have the presence of the fungus in almost all species, and even for the most common one, we know that it can kill them on very special circumstances during the year. All right, so I'm gonna thank you. Oh, I have another question. Okay. Do coquille tadpoles go through the same developmental stages in the egg, or they skip stages? They go through the same, but it varies also species by species. So we don't know exactly for example, for the coquille Mohun, might not be the same as for the common coquille frog. So that is something that people have to study. All right. I think that was the last one. So thank you again. Have a good night, and hope that you have learned something about frogs today. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight, and a special thank you to Zach, Rayna, and Ana for joining us for Night School. Please make sure to follow our guests. Next week, we're back with virtual nightlife, and it'll be a full program of space, so make sure to tune in. And
this is also the first time we've done this, but please subscribe to the Academy's YouTube channel. You'll get a notification whenever we schedule a new night school or nightlife. We also have a series that happens in the mornings called Breakfast Club. You'll get a notification for that too. Thanks so much again to our presenters, and thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful night.
Good night.